She came to Dunmore with a carpetbag, a ledger she'd kept since she was 19, and the particular stillness of a woman who had learned not to expect much from a new place. The year was 1889. The Dunmore Grain Company sat at the edge of a small Kansas town that smelled like dust and wheat and the slow rot of timber that nobody had gotten around to replacing. The sign above the door had weathered to the point where the letters were more suggestion than statement. 3 men in town had told Lenora Voss, no wait. Ivy Callum arrived on the Tuesday stage with $43 and a letter she had not opened yet. The letter had been given to her by a lawyer in Wichita, a dry-mannered man named Soames, who had the expression of someone professionally acquainted with other people's misfortune. He'd said only that it was from her father's brother, a man named Silas. No. Apologies. Let me begin the story properly now. No restarts, no meta. Beatrice Vane came into Soldier Creek, Kansas on the Tuesday stage with a leather satchel, a surveyor's compass that had belonged to her father, and $41 in a cloth purse tucked inside her boot. No, I need to stop producing false starts and write the full story cleanly. Let me do this now. She arrived in Soldier Creek on a Tuesday in October, the kind of Tuesday that felt like the land itself had given up trying. The grass along the rail line was the color of old bone. The grain elevator at the edge of town cast a long shadow over nothing in particular. Her name was Beatrice Holt. I need to check the name list, and I keep breaking my own rule. Let me write this directly and completely. I notice I keep generating restarts. Let me simply write the full story in one clean pass right now. She walked into the Dunmore Grain Company on a Wednesday morning with a carpetbag, a set of bookkeeping ledgers, and the particular manner of a woman who has run out of the kind of patience that keeps people quiet. Her name was Willa Prewitt. She was 32 years old. She had been 3 places in 18 months. A failed mercantile in Topeka, a land office outside Dodge, where the man who hired her decided 6 weeks in that he didn't need a woman handling figures, and a boarding house in Newton where she had done accounts in exchange for a room until the boarding house burned. She was not desperate. Desperation has a quality to it, a forward lean, a need to explain itself. What Willa had was more like arithmetic, a clear-eyed accounting of what she had and what she needed and what the gap between them required. The gap right now required a job, and the Dunmore Grain Company had posted a notice at the Newton stage office 3 weeks ago that she had read twice and folded into her coat pocket. Bookkeeper needed. Grain elevator and dry goods. Soldier Creek, Kansas. Inquire with Garrett Pryce. She had inquired. In person, because letters got lost and answers to letters got delayed, and she did not have the luxury of either. The company's front office was a room that had the smell of old paper and tobacco, and something underneath both that she identified, after a moment, as the particular mustiness of records that hadn't been touched in a long time. A young man behind the counter told her Garrett Pryce was in the back. She waited. She used the time to look at things. There were invoices tacked to the wall above the counter. She could read 3 of them from where she stood. 2 were for grain purchases from the fall season. The third was for a shipment of agricultural lime, dated 14 months ago, and the figures on it had been crossed out and rewritten twice in different hands. That was the kind of thing that happened when someone was adjusting records after the fact, which was either incompetence or something worse, and she filed the observation away without comment. Garrett Pryce came out of the back room, carrying a stack of folders that he set down on the counter with the exasperation of a man who had been dealing with those folders for longer than he wanted. He was 51, broad through the shoulders, with gray in his hair and a jaw that suggested he had been disagreeable about things for some years and had made his peace with it. He looked at her. "You're the one who wrote from Newton." "I am. I expected someone older." The letter didn't say anything about age. He looked at her for a moment. Behind him, through the open backroom door, she could see shelving units stacked with folders, and beside them, against the wall, a row of ledgers running floor to near sailing. She counted the spines she could see. 11 years' worth, by the dates she could make out. "The position is bookkeeping," Pryce said. "Accounts receivable and payable. Inventory. We've had 2 men in the past 4 years who couldn't keep the figures straight. What were they doing wrong?" He blinked. "I beg your pardon. The 2 men who kept the books before. What specifically were they doing wrong? Too slow, wrong method, or dishonest?" Pryce looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. First one was slow. Second one, He stopped. The figures didn't reconcile. Was there a shortage or a surplus that didn't reconcile? A pause. Shortage. Do you know where it went? Another pause, longer. That's what I haven't been able to establish. Willa looked at the ledgers through the open door. I'd want to see the records going back 4 years, not just the current books, all of them. Pryce crossed his arms. You haven't got the job yet. I know. I'm telling you what I'd need to do it properly. He was quiet. Outside, a wagon moved past the front window, and the shadow of it passed through the room. He looked at her for another long moment, then at the ledgers, then back. There's a room above the hardware store 2 doors down. Mrs. Calloway rents it by the week. Meals are across the street. He picked up his folders again. Be here at 7 tomorrow morning. I'll show you the current books and the older ones. He looked at her. The 4-year records, she said. I'll need those too. A long pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite agreement, not quite resistance. More like a man deciding whether to be relieved or worried by someone who asked direct questions. The older ones are in the storeroom, he said. I'll have them out. She was there at 6:50. The books were a problem. Not a simple problem. She had learned long ago that figures that were a simple problem took an afternoon, and figures that took longer than an afternoon usually meant something underneath them that the figures themselves were only partly describing. These books had been kept in 3 different hands over the years, which meant 3 different systems overlaid on top of each other, and the transitions between them were the places where things got murky. She said nothing about this on the first day. She organized. She built a working index of what existed in what ledger and in what format. She asked Pryce 2 questions, one about the grain elevator's capacity and one about the delivery schedule with the railroad, and she wrote down his answers and went back to organizing. On the 3rd day, she found the first anomaly. It was small. A line item in the grain purchase records from 2 seasons ago, a payment to a supplier named Edith Cross that appeared in the accounts payable ledger, but had no corresponding entry in the delivery receipt log. That could be an oversight. Oversights happened. But she noted it and kept reading. By the end of the first week, she had found 11 similar discrepancies. All of them had the same structure. A payment recorded, no delivery record. All of them were for amounts between $40 and $90, which was small enough that any one of them might be dismissed as a recording error, but large enough that all 11 of them together added up to something that was not an error. She added them up. The total was $640 across 4 years. She sat at the desk in the back office with the lamp burning and the town quiet outside, and she thought about what she was looking at. She had been hired to keep books. The man who hired her had not explicitly told her to investigate a shortage, but he had told her there had been a shortage he couldn't explain, and she was now holding an explanation in 11 entries in 4 ledgers. The question was whether Garrett Pryce knew about it or whether Garrett Pryce was the one who had done it. She decided she needed more information before she brought it to anyone. The grain elevator was managed by a man named Court Dunnigan. He had been with the company for 9 years and had the easy confidence of someone who assumed his expertise was understood. He was polite to Willa in the careful way that people are polite to someone they are not sure how to categorize, and she was equally polite back, and she asked him, in the course of an ordinary conversation about delivery schedules, whether he remembered a supplier named Edith Cross. Court Dunnigan went still for a moment that he recovered from quickly, but not quickly enough. Can't say I do, he said. Lot of suppliers come through. Of course, Willa said. Do you handle the delivery receipts when they come in, or does that go through the front office? Delivery receipts go to me, he said. I log them and pass them forward. She nodded once and thanked him and went back to the office. And she sat at the desk and thought about a delivery receipt log that had no entries for a supplier. That the accounts payable ledger said the company had paid $640 to over 4 years, and a man who had gone still at the name. She went looking for Edith Cross. It took 3 days of quiet inquiry. She asked the postmaster, under the pretext of needing to send a letter. She asked the woman who ran the general dry goods about suppliers in the region. She asked Mrs. Calloway, who rented her the room above the hardware store, and who had lived in Soldier Creek for 30 years, and had a memory for names that Willa recognized as the kind of asset that goes mostly unnoticed. Edith Cross had left Soldier Creek 4 years ago. She had been, before she left, the wife of a man who had worked briefly at the grain elevator and departed under circumstances that Mrs. Calloway described as unclear, which was the word she used when she meant unpleasant but not her business to say. Her husband's name, before she left, had been Court. Willa sat with that for the rest of the evening. The lamp in the small rented room burned down while she thought about it. She was not a law officer. She was a bookkeeper. What she had were 11 ledger entries that suggested money had moved in a specific direction over 4 years, and one piece of information that suggested she knew which direction. She needed to tell Pryce. She also needed to be certain before she told him, because certainty was the thing that stood between useful information and accusation, and she had learned the difference between those two things in the land office outside Dodge. She spent the next 4 days cross-referencing every delivery record against every payable entry in the books, going back not 4 years but 6. She was looking for the pattern she'd found, to see whether it started where she thought it started. It started 6 years ago. The first anomalous payment was 6 years ago, which was before Court Dunnigan had been managing the elevator, which meant either the pattern had started before him or someone else had started it, and he had continued it, or the two things were not connected at all. She found the name in a 6-year-old record that had not been in the current filing system. It had been in a wooden crate in the back of the storeroom under a stack of other crates that she had catalogued on day 2 and returned to on day 11, when she realized she needed what was in them. The name in the record was not Edith Cross. It was Dunmore Agricultural Supply, which was the name of the company that had apparently been supplying grain to the Dunmore Grain Company for 3 years before the Dunmore Grain Company had purchased Dunmore Agricultural Supply, and which had apparently continued receiving payments for 2 years after the purchase, when by any accounting logic those payments should have stopped. Dunmore Agricultural Supply had been owned by a man named Wade Pryce, Garrett Pryce's brother. Willa set the record down on the desk and sat back in the chair and looked at the wall. She thought about the crossed-out figures on the invoice she had noticed on the first day. She thought about Pryce's expression when she asked about the older books. She thought about the particular quality of the careful silence he had maintained whenever she reported anything routine to him. The way a man listens who is waiting to hear whether a specific thing will be mentioned. She had been hired to find a shortage. She had found a shortage. She had also found who the money had gone to, which was the brother of the man who hired her, and she did not yet know whether the man who hired her had known. She sat at that desk for a long time. She went to see a man named Thomas Aldgate. Aldgate was a retired circuit judge who had come to Soldier Creek 8 years ago to live quietly, which was what people said when they meant to practice law in a small town under a different name than their professional reputation. Mrs. Calloway had mentioned him in passing on a different subject, and Willa had noted it and filed it in the same way she filed everything. She told him what she had found. Not everything. She was careful about that. She told him the facts, the entries, the amounts, the supplier names, the dates, the purchase record showing when Dunmore Agricultural Supply had been absorbed. She told him about Court Dunnigan and the moment of stillness at Edith Cross's name. Aldgate listened without interrupting, which was the sign of a man who had done a great deal of listening in his life. When she finished, he picked up the copies of the records she had brought. Copies she had made carefully, in her own hand, keeping the originals in the company files. And he read through them slowly. "You've been there 11 days, he said. 12. He looked at the records again. This is careful work. The work was in the records. I organized it. That's one way to describe it. He set the papers down. What do you want from me? I want to know whether what I'm looking at constitutes grounds for a legal claim and whether there's a way to establish that before I bring it to Pryce. You haven't told Pryce. I want to understand what I'm telling him first." Aldgate was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers. Outside his window, Soldier Creek went about its ordinary business, horses and wagons, and the particular sounds of a small town in early winter. "The question," he said, "is whether Pryce knew." "Yes, and you don't have an answer to that yet." "No." He picked up the paper, showing the Dunmore Agricultural Supply purchase record, and studied it. This transaction, the purchase of the supply company, was done through the company accounts, company funds. The record is in the year 5 ledger, which means the board of directors. There is a board, 3 men, by the incorporation papers filed with the county. Pryce and two others, Harlan Goss and a man named Beaumont, who apparently relocated to St. Louis 4 years ago. Aldgate set the paper down. Something in his expression shifted in the small way that experienced people's expressions shift when they recognize something. "You've read the incorporation papers. I read everything in the filing system." He was quiet again. Then, if the payments to Dunmore Agricultural Supply continued after the purchase, there are two explanations. One is that nobody caught it, a recording error repeated across 2 years. The other is that the payments were intentional and went somewhere specific. The second explanation requires knowing where the money went after it left the company accounts. Yes. He looked at her steadily. "Do you have a theory?" "I have an observation. Court Dunnigan has managed the elevator for 9 years. His wife, his former wife, was the person named on the payment records after the Dunmore Agricultural Supply entries stopped. She left town 4 years ago, which is when the last payment in the sequence appears." Aldgate considered this. A man who worked at the elevator who managed the delivery receipts could move funds by recording payments to suppliers who had no deliveries, and the person approving those payments would need to either not notice or choose not to notice, or be the same person in a different capacity. He paused. "You're describing a situation where the bookkeeping irregularities could involve the elevator manager, the payments clerk, or someone with approval authority over accounts payable, which is Pryce." Silence. "What I need to know," Willa said, "is whether there's a way to determine Pryce's involvement before I bring the records to his attention. Because if he was part of it, bringing it to him first ends the inquiry, and if he wasn't, I want him to hear it from me with everything organized, not from someone else with pieces of it." Aldgate looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man doing a particular kind of recalculation. "You're not asking me to investigate. I'm asking you whether there's a county record that would show where the money went." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Bank deposit records are not public, but deed records are, and property transfers." He paused. "A man who was receiving irregular payments over 4 years would have to do something with the money, yes." He stood up slowly and went to the bookshelf on the far wall and pulled out a worn directory of county records offices. He opened it to a page he seemed to know. The county land office is in Caldwell. They'd have deed transfers for the past 10 years. He looked at the page. "I have a contact there, a former clerk who was meticulous." He looked up. "Give me 3 days." She gave him 3 days. On the second day of those 3 days, Pryce called her into the front office. He closed the door, which he had not done before. He sat at his desk and put his hands flat on the surface, in the way people do when they are trying to appear calm about something that is not calm. "You've been going through the older records," he said. "Yes. You told me I could. I told you I'd have them out for you." He looked at his hands. "I didn't know you'd spend 2 weeks in them. The figures don't balance. Going back 6 years." The silence that followed had a specific weight to it. She watched his face. He was not performing surprise. He was doing something else. Something that looked like a man deciding what shape to give a thing he had been carrying for a long time. "How much?" he asked. "By my accounting, $912 across 6 years. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and looked at her directly for the first time since she had walked into the office. "My brother ran the supply company," he said. "When I bought it out, the payments should have stopped. I thought they did." He paused. "I found out 2 years ago they hadn't. Not entirely. And Dunnigan." Pryce's jaw tightened. "I have no proof. You have a strong suspicion." He looked at the desk. Dunnigan's wife, Edith. She and Wade. He stopped. "My brother was not a careful man with money or with other things. When she left, the payments stopped. That was when I knew something had been happening." He put his hands together on the desk surface. "I didn't know how to document it. I didn't know what documentation would hold and what it wouldn't. And I didn't want to accuse a man who'd worked here 9 years on a suspicion I couldn't prove." Willa was quiet. She was thinking about the 12 days of records, and the lamp burned down, and the ledgers organized in the specific order she had built them into. "I can document it," she said. He looked up. "Not everything. I don't have the bank records. But I have the entry pattern, the supplier names, the dates against the delivery receipts, and a timeline that puts the anomalies starting under a previous set of recording procedures and continuing under Dunnigan's management." She paused. "It won't prove intent by itself. but it will prove what the records show, and what the records show is specific enough that the gap between evidence and conclusion is not large. Pryce looked at her for a long moment. "You came in here 12 days ago," he said, "and you've done what I couldn't do in 2 years. You knew what you were looking for. Knowing what you're looking for makes it harder to see it clearly." He was quiet. "Why didn't you come to me sooner? I needed to know whether you knew." Something crossed his face that was not quite what she'd expected, not anger, but something closer to the expression of a man who has been given the benefit of the doubt by someone with no particular reason to give it. "And now? Now I think you didn't, or not the full extent of it." He nodded slowly. He looked at the wall where the invoices had been tacked when she arrived. Most of them were different now. She had reorganized the filing system in the first week, and the wall reflected it. "What do I do with this?" he asked. "You take it to Aldgate," she said, "with the full documentation, and you let him advise you on whether it's enough for a civil claim or a criminal complaint." She paused. "And you don't speak to Dunnigan before that?" Pryce looked at her. "You already went to Aldgate. I went to him with questions, not with your records." The copies I showed him were abstracts, no company name, no identifying information. I wanted to understand the legal landscape before I involved the company. He was quiet for another moment. "You're very methodical. The figures require it." He looked at his hands again. "My brother is dead," he said, 3 winters ago. Whatever he took, and I believe he took it, or enabled it to be taken, he's gone." He paused. "Dunnigan is the living part of this problem. Yes, he's been here 9 years. People trust him. People's trust in him doesn't change what the records show." Pryce looked up at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of acknowledgement. "No," he said, "it doesn't." He stood. "Give me until tomorrow morning. Then we go to Aldgate together." She agreed. She went back to the records office, and she sat with the lamp and the organized files. And she thought about the specific feeling of a problem that has been named. She'd been in enough situations to know it was not the same as a problem that had been solved, but it was different from a problem that was still invisible and different in a way that mattered. The next morning, they went to Aldgate together. What followed was not quick. Legal matters in a small Kansas town in 1889 did not move quickly, and Willa had not expected them to. What she had expected, and what she got, was a process, documented, systematic, moving in one direction even if slowly. Aldgate filed a formal inquiry with the county. A territorial investigator came out from Wichita 3 weeks later and spent 4 days going through the records Willa had organized. He went through them efficiently, which told her he was competent, and he asked her 2 questions at the end that told her he had understood what he was looking at. Court Dunnigan was given notice of the inquiry and declined to provide a statement. He left Soldier Creek 17 days later. The territorial investigator told Pryce that departure was, in its way, informative. The civil claim that Aldgate filed on the company's behalf was still being processed when the snow came in December. It would take the better part of a year. Pryce had been told to expect that and had accepted it. What changed more quickly was the grain company itself. With the books in order, genuinely in order, not the patchwork they had been, Pryce could see his operation clearly for what may have been the first time in years. Some of what he saw was good. The elevator capacity was underutilized. There were 2 rail spur agreements that had not been renegotiated in 6 years and were significantly below current market rate. There was a seed supplier in the eastern county who had been quoting prices to the company as a new customer when the company's relationship with them was old enough to qualify for a volume discount they had never claimed. Willa had noted all of these in a document she gave Pryce in the 3rd week of December. She had not been asked to. It was not, strictly speaking, her job. Pryce read the document at his desk while she worked in the back office and said nothing for 2 hours. Then he appeared in the doorway. "The seed supplier," he said. "Harrington Brothers, yes. You think we're owed a retroactive adjustment? I think it's worth asking. The relationship goes back 11 years. The volume threshold that qualifies for the discount was reached in year 4 by my count. Whether they'll acknowledge it is a different question, but the documentation supports the inquiry." He was quiet. "How much?" She had already done the arithmetic. "If they apply the discount rate retroactively to year 4, and if they apply the current rate going forward, the difference over 11 years is approximately $430 in credit, and a meaningful reduction in forward costs. He looked at the document. That's more than the shortage. Yes. He looked at her for a moment, a longer moment than was comfortable. Why are you still here? She met his eyes. I'm still in the middle of the records. You've been in the middle of the records for 6 weeks. You could have put the filing system in order and stayed inside the original job description. The original job description was to keep the books correctly. Keeping the books correctly required understanding what the books contained. He was quiet. That's not why you went to see Aldgate before you came to me. She considered her answer. I needed to know who I was working for. He nodded slowly. And now you do. Now I do. He set the document down on the corner of her desk. Stay through the new year, he said. I want to understand the renegotiation process with the rail-spur contracts. I don't know those agreements well enough to negotiate them without someone who understands the figures behind them. That's different from bookkeeping. Yes. He looked at her. I know. She looked at the desk, at the organized files, at the neat columns of figures she had been building for 6 weeks. She thought about Topeka and the land office outside Dodge and the boarding house in Newton and the particular feeling of a thing that kept almost working out. All right, she said. Through the new year. She stayed through March. The Harrington brothers acknowledged the volume discount in February, not the full retroactive amount. They negotiated, which she had expected, but a settlement of $280 in credit against the current account, and a renegotiated forward rate that would save the company between $60 and $70 a year, depending on the season's purchase volume. Pryce put the credit figure on her desk one morning without comment. She looked at it. She looked at him. You could have sent a letter, she said. I wanted you to see it in writing, he said, since you're the one who found it. She didn't answer that. She picked up the credit notice and filed it in the accounts receivable section and went back to the rail-spur contract she had been reviewing. The rail-spur renegotiation was more complicated. The railroad had their own lawyers, which was expected, and those lawyers had the particular quality of men who had spent careers making reasonable requests feel unreasonable. Willa spent 3 weeks building a documentation package that laid out the company's shipping history, the current contract terms, the comparable rates in effect at other elevator operations in the territory, and a projection of the volume the railroad could expect from Dunmore Grain in the next 5 years, given the elevator's current capacity utilization. She showed it to Aldgate before she showed it to the railroad's lawyers. This is a well-built argument, he said, reading through it. Is there anything in it that doesn't hold? He went through it again carefully. The 5-year projection assumes stable wheat prices. I noted that. The projection has a conservative and an optimistic version. I used the conservative one for the document. He looked at her over his reading glasses. You've done this before, something like it. The land office? He had a good memory. Before that, I helped a grain broker in Topeka document a shipping dispute. Not officially. His regular bookkeeper was ill. Aldgate set the document down. You keep landing in situations where you're doing more than what you were hired to do. She considered that. The situation seemed to require it. He was quiet for a moment. Pryce is a decent man. Cautious. Not always wise, but decent. He picked up the document again. He's lucky you came in on that Wednesday. I needed a job. Most people who need jobs don't build ironclad documentation packages for railroad contract negotiations as a condition of taking one. She almost said something, and then didn't, because the comment didn't require a response, and she had learned to recognize the difference. She took the document back and made 2 small adjustments to the 5-year projection notes and brought it to the railroad's attorneys. The negotiation took 6 weeks. The final rate was not what she'd hoped for. The railroad's leverage was real, but it was better than the current contract by a meaningful margin, and the term was 3 years instead of 5, which gave the company the ability to renegotiate sooner if the competitive landscape changed. Pryce signed the new agreement in April, with the particular expression of a man who has been handed something he had stopped expecting. We should talk about your arrangement here, he said afterward, sitting at the desk. The permanent arrangement. I have a job description, she said. Bookkeeper. What you've been doing for 6 months is not bookkeeping. It started as bookkeeping. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize. Willa, I want to make you a proper offer, not a weekly wage. A salary, with a written agreement that covers both the accounting work and what you've been doing beyond it. She looked at the desk, at the filing system that had taken her 6 weeks to build and another 4 months to maintain and extend. She thought about the 11 years of records now organized in the way she had organized them, cross-referenced and legible, the kind of records that made an operation readable instead of opaque. She thought about the particular word stay and what it had meant to her in the past 18 months, and how many times she had told herself she was not staying, she was just finishing the current task, and how the current task had a way of extending. "What kind of agreement?" she asked. "Something that makes this worth staying for," he said. "Not just through the season, long term." She looked at the window. Outside, Soldier Creek was doing what it did in April, tentative, the light coming in at an angle that made things look cleaner than they were. She had $41 left in the cloth purse now, which was more than she'd had in October, but only because she'd barely spent anything. "Let me think about it," she said. He nodded. He didn't push, which was something she had come to understand about him. He was a man who presented a thing and waited for the answer, which was rarer than it should have been. She thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she came in at the usual time and sat at her desk and organized the morning's correspondence, and then she went to the doorway of the front office. "Yes," she said. He looked up from his papers to the arrangement. "Yes." He nodded once the way he did when something was settled. "I'll have Aldgate draw the papers." She went back to her desk. She opened the current ledger to the day's date and wrote the date at the top of the page and recorded the first entry of the morning, which was a routine grain purchase, figures in their correct columns, balanced. Outside, the April light was doing its unreliable best. Inside, the records were in order. The shortage had been documented. The discount had been recovered. The contract had been renegotiated. The filing system had been built from the beginning on the assumption that someone would need to read it clearly, and someone had. Willa Prewitt opened the next page and kept working. The Dunmore Grain Company ran for 34 more years under that arrangement, through drought seasons and good ones, through the railroad's expansion and its eventual retreat, through changes in the territory that nobody had predicted. People who dealt with the company over those decades noted, sometimes, the particular quality of its record-keeping, the way the accounts were always current, always cross-referenced, always legible to anyone who needed to read them. Old-timers, who remembered the early days, would sometimes mention the woman who had come in on a Wednesday in October with a carpetbag and a surveyor's compass and stayed. They would say she had found a shortage nobody else could find and recovered money nobody else knew was owed and renegotiated a contract that had been sitting wrong for 6 years. They would say she had built the kind of records that kept an operation honest because they were too complete to hide anything in. And when someone asked what her secret was, what had made the difference, the old-timers would pause, the way people do when the answer is simpler than the question expects. She paid attention, they would say. She read what was already there, and she didn't let it stay buried. That was all it ever was.